It has been a tumultuous spring and summer. First, the COVID-19 pandemic and the killing of George Floyd, giving rise to Black Lives Matter and demonstrations demanding police accountability. Kaleidoscope visited Lincoln Memorial United Methodist Church on Main Street in Buffalo to talk with Pastor George Nicholas about Black Lives Matter and the theological response to systematic racism in America. Well, I'm really pleased to have Pastor George Nicholas invite us to Lincoln Memorial United Methodist, a very historic church. Welcome, Pastor Nicholas.
Thank you so much, Stan, and it's an honor to be here and have you here with us at Lincoln Church, which we're about over 80 years old, and we have been a stalwart here on the east side of Buffalo for all that time. It's a historically black congregation which has been grounded in the social gospel and community activism. One of our pastors, Reverend Willard Williams, was a great friend of Dr. Martin Luther King, and a classmate of his at Boston University. So we have a rich tradition here.
And how long have you been here at Lincoln Memorial?
Well, that's an interesting question because I actually grew up here. So
really?
This was my home church, and so I received Christ, was baptized, and was actually married in this building as well. But through our system, the United Methodist Church, where we have an itinerant system, I was in Rochester for 12 years at Grace Church, and then the bishop had called to ask me to serve here. It's very difficult when you come back to your home church as pastor because people have seen you in very different roles.
I think there's a story of Jesus.
Yeah. But, it's part of God's plan, and I'm excited about it. And I've been back here as pastor for about 8 years.
8 years. And you already know the community, so...
Yeah, I know the community, but the community there's so much that has changed, but it's so much that has remained the same. And a lot of the struggles as we deal with structural and systemic racism that we used to talk about here as a church when I was a child. We're still having those conversations, so.
Well, back on May 25th, George Floyd was murdered by a policeman in Minneapolis. And wonder if you could share kind of your own reaction to that event.
You know what the most interesting reaction, Stan, is kind of strange, is that I wasn't surprised. And that's what's kind of getting scary now, is that when these things happen, and because they've been so repetitive, where unarmed African American men and women have found themselves in very bad situations with law enforcement, and at times will lead to their death. But then thinking about it and seeing it, I only watched it once. And I would encourage people, when sometimes we re-traumatize ourselves when we keep seeing these acts of violence against our people. It really broke my heart, and it made me think about my own vulnerability as a black man in America dealing with law enforcement, and then reflecting upon the fact that I have 4 sons.
Yeah, that would be a big concern.
Absolutely.
What do you say to your sons?
Well, I'm very honest with them. And, one thing about, being in this kind of a digital world, it's not a lot you can keep from your kids anyway, and they're not kids. I mean, my oldest is 22, and then I have one who is 21, and then one who's 19, and one who's 15. So they're right at that age, right, of where, unfortunately, because of, that we haven't really addressed the issue of systemic racism in America. We've talked around it, but we haven't really addressed it. That they're right in that cohort where law enforcement, without knowing their stories, without knowing who they are, not knowing that they're scholars and good servants in their church, but that shouldn't even matter, right? I mean, people shouldn't, even if you're a criminal, you don't deserve to be executed on the street. And so they have to be smarter. They got to be smarter than really have to be smarter, more disciplined than the person that may pull them over.
So you're telling your sons to be smarter. What did you say, and what do you continue to say to your church?
Well, so we've had John Elmore and over here, the attorney John Elmore, come, and he has done some training over the years with some of our young men about what to do when you're pulled over by the police. We constantly, talk as a family, and when I talk to other young men, not just, my own sons, to if you find yourself where you're pulled over or encountering law enforcement, you have to just be overly cautious. And it's not a question of your manhood or anything like that. It's just a question of staying alive. Should it be that way? No. But this is the present reality. So do what you have to do in order to stay alive, while the rest of us work on trying to change the system.
Now, one of the things you talk a lot about is a theological response to the causes of systematic racism. Now, for some, that's a mouthful, but talk to us about what that means.
Well, for me, being a United Methodist pastor and being in the Christian tradition, our role model or our inspiration, our instructor, is Jesus Christ. And certainly when you look at how Jesus, there's this fixation within the church about Jesus' birth and about his death.
Right.
And we really don't spend enough time talking about his ethics, his teachings, how he pushed back against a lot of social systems within the church and within community that were oppressive to the poor and marginalized in their communities. And when we think about Jesus centering the Samaritans in many of his teachings and his parables, and without fully understanding the context of the great animosity and hatred that the Jews were taught within their own religious system. So it was appropriate to have these bad feelings about Samaritans.
And the woman as well.
Absolutely.
Jesus said,
right. So now you get sexism and racism in one story. And how Jesus, by doing that, he makes a very bold and powerful statement, not only to the community in which he was talking to at that time, but also to all of us who are able to read and hear the stories now, that if you are a person that really claims to be a follower of Jesus Christ, that you cannot be tolerant of any type of system that oppresses people just by the basis of their ethnicity. I mean, the concept of race is something that was created, by, the Europeans when they began to start to kidnap black Africans and then, take over the land here. And so it's really about ethnicity and at that time religious affiliation. And how Jesus clearly, in all of his parables, centered the Samaritan as people of virtue or people of worth. Saw them, encountered them, talked to them, embraced their humanity. And so we could easily, as followers of Christ, apply that thought process to the issues of systemic racism that exists here in America.
But, whenever we talk about race, it eventually goes down, the people begin to argue, well, I'm not a racist, there's not a racist bone in my body. The first pastor I worked under said that to me after having been on a venture with Dr. King, and he said, there's not a racist bone in my body. Right. But that's the argument we always get. Others will say, yes, and I'm trying to deal with my personal racism. But a step up from that is systematic. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, the system here in America was, grounded and formed in the ideology of white supremacy. You can't just go into a land and take the land from a person and then come in and grab other folks and get them to work that land for free. That's morally wrong, right? And so when we think about, and every system that has been birthed out of the American experiment, right from the beginning with 3/5 of a man. The Dred Scott decision where, that a black man possesses no rights that a white man must respect, right? And all throughout history, there's been this division. And so when you think about every system, every institution in America is infused with this ideology. And so you can't escape it. And so when you have to look at it from a system and then figure out a way to respond. For me, Stan, I recently, had to really come to grips with my own issues as it relates to gender and people's sexual preferences, right? And knowing that it wasn't enough for me to not be homophobic. It wasn't enough for me to not be misogynist. But I had to understand that those ideologies operate within community, and that I had to engage in standing up for women and people in same-sex loving relationships, as opposed to just passively saying, well, my own values don't do it, because that doesn't really help anybody. The same as race. So I would invite, white people to understand the system that we exist, that was created, and understanding it's the system that causes people like that man who put what was so interesting about this, Stan, is how as he knelt upon George Floyd's neck, he did it with such impunity, as if there was nothing socially or morally unacceptable by my behavior. Well, that just doesn't come from kind of an individual pathology, but it comes also from functioning in community, whereas that might not be deemed inappropriate. And then the other officers, and there's no scenario where someone could do that to a white person in broad daylight and not have people in either the individual co-workers reflect about maybe that I shouldn't be doing this.
But some people will turn and say, and we hear it commonly, but those were ancestors. I didn't cause all of this.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's not a very strong argument. I mean, the fact that the fact that America was built off the backs of African people, free labor, it funded the system here. It funded the Industrial Revolution, right? And so there was benefit that was derived. People talk about, what about my ancestors came from Italy and Ireland and all these other places? Yeah, but there would have been nothing for them to come to if there wasn't a bustling economy that was established 100 years ago. African people were the first currency. They were the first. If you would go into a bank and say, well, I need a loan to expand my plantation, one of the things they would ask you is, how many slaves do you own? So the first level of collateral in the banking system to make America where it is today were the bodies of black and brown people. And so we have to recognize that there is a bill that is due. I know the show isn't about reparations, but we talk a lot about, there's a lot of talk about looking at things through the racial equity lens. I would challenge us to move forward and move it from into a reparative thing. We talk about restorative justice is a big buzzword now, whatever. Well, let's apply this to the issue of race. If I broke into your house 6 days and just stole everything for 6 days, and then on the 7th day I said, you know what, Stan, I'm not going to break into your house anymore, and so let's kind of look beyond that. I'm sorry, maybe I shouldn't have done it. That wouldn't be, no, I'd have to return all the stuff that I stole over those 6 days, right, so that we could kind of be in a sense of reconciliation and restoration in our lives.
Well, this is really helpful. It's got to be an ongoing conversation. And I thank you so much, Pastor George Nicholas, and for inviting us here to have this initial conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.